All right, today we're going to be doing a picture of our hand holding an object. We're going to do a drawing and then we're going to watercolor it. So what we're going to need today is our hand. We're going to use our non-dominant hand for our model, so we don't make it any harder than it needs to be. Some kind of object to hold, something hand-sized-ish, and a piece of watercolor paper. This needs to be bigger than 8 by 10. It could be any size bigger than that. Probably slightly bigger is good. We're going to need our viewfinder, plastic sheet. We're going to need our dry erase marker. Then we're going to need a pencil. We're going to need watercolors. Let's stick these out. There we go. What a display. Probably an eraser. And a couple brushes. We're also going to need something to put water in and a paper towel. So yeah, let's get started. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to set our drawing field or format. So we want to kind of get our plastic sheet centered, and we probably want a little more extra on the bottom than on the top. Doesn't really matter if we're matting the work later, but I'm going to go ahead and take our pencil and just trace around our viewfinder plastic sheet so we have our format laid out. All right, so I've got a big old ruler. That's all I've got handy. Anyway, I'm going to use that to measure and mark my halfway points. So my viewfinder is 8 inches by 10 inches. So I'm going to mark it 4 inches on the top and the bottom. And I'm going to turn it sideways. If you have a normal sized ruler, you might not need to turn it sideways. I'm going to mark at 5 inches. Here and here. All right. So that long ruler is pretty unwieldy. So I folded myself a straight edge just out of a regular piece of paper. It doesn't measure, so I can't use it to mark the halfway points. I could figure out where they were just by trial and error, but it's a little easier to measure. But I can use it to draw my lines. So I'm going to draw these lines really faintly because I want to erase them later to destroy the evidence of my cheating. All right, so that's a real light line. You might not be able to see it, but I can see it, so it's all good. So I'm just going to connect the marks on the top and bottom as well as the marks on the sides. And I'm going to do diagonals. So you can see this straight edge is not long enough to do the diagonals all the way. All I have to do is match up the corner here and this intersection, and that should be on the right line there. And then I can readjust a little bit to get my diagonal in. There we go. That's a little off, but it's more or less right. It should be fine. All right, so then we're going to do the same thing on our sheet with our dry erase marker. Just mark here, 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 and here. And I'll go ahead and use my straight edge. I want to be careful not to smudge our dry erase marker. Let's see how that goes. Just want to set it down and not move it. Should be all right. Yeah, not too bad. I scooted it around on there a little bit. We'll see if I smudged anything. Okay, we're okay. All right, so we're going to do our layout trick one more time. After this, we're going to look at variations on this and using it for other things, but for now, just kind of straight up the way we've been doing it. Looks good. All right. So there we go. So now this matches this. Boom, and we're ready to rock. All right, so now we want to lay these out next to each other. If you can get them lined up like this, that's super useful because you can tell exactly, I can tell how high is this finger going to be. I just go straight over. Makes it a little easier. So if you want to do that, you can. I'm going to use a little tape because I'm on an angled board. If you're just flat on the table, you probably don't need the tape. Makes your life easier. All right, so there we go. Now I'm going to try to transfer this information over to here so I have a general sort of layout of where everything's supposed to be. So what I want to do is kind of use my dot to dot method here. So I've got my forearm coming in right from this corner here and intersecting about here. So I'm just going to draw that line segment in. I'm drawing lightly again. I'm going to try to go a little darker just because I'm doing a demo video. But when you draw, you want to draw just dark enough for you to see it. You'll notice we're not toning the paper today. That's because we're going to do watercolor on here. So that should be clean, I think. I'm going to go with a slightly darker pencil here. All right, so next thing I'm going to run into is this horizontal line. So I'm going to measure that out. Let's figure that out. I'm going to measure that to about right here. So I'm using my finger here to mark the edge of the plastic and the point of my pencil to mark where the line intersects. And I'm going to place that over here. You just kind of edge it up. And there we go. So we've got something going this way till about here. Got a little bit of a wrist lump here. And then we kind of curve down. So this line kind of goes up like this and connects to that lump. All right. So now we've got this. This is going to be our next intersection. So I'm going to measure along that diagonal line. I'm going to pinch it where the edge of the plastic is and put the point on where that contour intersects my guideline there. Just make a little dot there. All right, so now I want to look at this shape here. So I can sight this angle. This angle comes up like this, dives in a little bit, comes back out, and then heads up towards here. The mark there is a little dark. That's all right though. Okay, so let's see. I want to see where this comes down. I'm going to look at the tip of that thumb there, measure that. So that's going to be about here. You can also, if you want, measure how far it is in from the side. This isn't on one of the guidelines, so it's a little bit trickier, but that's okay. It's about here, that tip of the thumb. So you can take that shape, move it up here. There's a lot of like kind of nuance to this line. It's kind of jaggedy. That's mostly just a factor of me trying to draw it with that dry erase marker. So I don't necessarily need to worry about all that detail. When I come back in with my pen, I'm going to be more focused on getting an accurate contour line. But for now, I'm just blocking in proportions. Got a little bit of bone peeking out back here. This thing's a vertebrae from some kind of hooved herbivore, I believe. Probably a cow. All right. So next, we're going to kind of look at this line here. So I'm going to figure out how far down it is from the center here. Measure that. Measure here and mark. So it's kind of going like that. And then I'm going to sight the angle. So the angle's like this. I'm going to take that angle over and draw it in. All right. So then we have this guy coming up to about here. Gonna add that dot in. Replicate the shape I see there. All right. And now we come back to right about here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at the shape that's made by this curve and these guidelines. You can't really see it because of the, yeah, just right there. Boop, boop, boop. I'm going to try to replicate that shape. So we want to kind of look at all the different shapes we're making. All of these are different shapes. The positive shapes and the guidelines make little shapes. The negative space around it makes shapes. We want to kind of look at all the shapes around, and we want to think about not necessarily focusing on the shape we're trying to make, sometimes focusing on the shapes next to it, or the shape of the negative space, things like that. All right, so this kind of comes down at this angle to here. So it's kind of like this. There's a little bit more detail to it. It kind of comes out this way and then kind of curves back in. I'll lay that line in right there. All right, so let's keep going. Let's figure out where the tip of this finger is. Oops. Boop, 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 boop. Gonna measure the top there and try to get it at about the right spot. But then I can measure this way and make sure I'm in the right spot. I think early on, it's really important to check. That's actually really good. Really important to check things out. As you get experienced, you'll be able to do it without having to double check everything. But just understanding the methods of doing that, I think, are super useful. Even if you're not always measuring with your pencil, just kind of practicing that, I think, helps you learn how to do it with your eye. And that's probably the goal we're really going for here. But we're just taking baby steps for now. All right, so now I'm going to figure out where this crosses the guideline. So let's check that out. Measure right there. All right, so that's kind of the idea. I'm gonna maybe speed things up. Maybe already did that. All right, so once we get this transferred over, we can do our check. I'm gonna pull my tape off. If you're just doing this on the table, you have an easier job. But really we want our drawing surface to be like parallel to our face. So an angled board is really super useful. When you have it flat on the table, the perspective gets a little skewed, and that can be an issue. All right, so I'm comparing it, and I can see a little bit of difference there, but I think it's close enough that with my hand moving around while I'm drawing, it's not going to cause an issue. So I think we're pretty good here, and we're ready to move on to the next step. All right, so now we're going to start inking everything in. I'm going to be inking with a Uniball Vision fine point pen. Make a little mark there. You want to make sure you've got a pen that is waterproof. And if you aren't sure, you should test that out. Doing a little mark on your paper, then going over with some water. Mine's bleeding right now. Give it a little time to dry maybe, but since I'm doing a demo, I'm not going to do that. But this is a waterproof pen. If you don't have a waterproof pen, when you apply your watercolors, it's going to make the pen lines bleed. So check it for color fast or water fastness. Let's see. So first thing we have to do is kind of reestablish our pose. We've been moving stuff around. So I'm going to uncap my pen here, have that ready to go, and I'm going to get my hand back into position. Okay. So I have to refine that orientation. I have my pinky down here like this. And if you can't find the exact position, well, it's a bummer, but it's okay. It's not a huge problem. Okay. There we go, something like that. That's about right. Okay. It's trickier to do than I thought it was going to be. All right. So there we go. So we've got our model and our drawing. So we're going to go straight to the pen and try to get our contour lines in. So you could also go and establish contour lines with a pencil first if you were feeling unconfident. But today as an exercise, we're just going to try to use the pen right away. So I'm just going to kind of follow through and draw on all the lines. Let's do some tricky spots to kind of get the idea for that. So as we're doing this, we want to really think about kind of the nuances of what's going on with our contour lines. So they're going to make the drawing a lot more interesting. Like maybe, yeah, having a hard time finding that position again. Gosh, all right. Let's set more of this angle. So I feel like it's maybe in here. There we go. Okay, there, I found it. We're better. All right. It's one of the trickiest parts of these drawings, I think. Anyway, we want to go in and look close and try to find all the details. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up as I go through this. We don't have to watch the whole thing. I'll be back in a minute. Yeah, that's not right. More like that. There we go. Okay. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. There are some things where I had to rejigger things a little bit or fudge a little bit, but that's okay. It could be hard to get your hand back into the exact same pose. It's one of the tricky spots here. So you either need to think about how to adjust what you have or how to move your hand to get a more accurate version of what you're seeing. As you go through this, don't just retrace your pencil lines. Really look at the edges and contours and try to get them in your painting there, or in your pen inking, your line work. And try to pay attention and notice the subtle things. Think about also your line weight. You may want heavier lines in different places. You can kind of re-go over and adjust them. You may want lines where you kind of just string together little bits of texture. You may have like lost lines that you don't draw in because they're faint or whatever. So think about all that as you're walking through. You may want to add a little bit of texture or nuance here. There's something I didn't notice here before. Kind of coming like this. I want to get those details. We can also add to this after we add the watercolor. So I think this is good enough to add the watercolor in, and then maybe we'll come back and do some more line work as well. All right, so let's move on to the watercolor phase. All right, if we give our inking a second to dry, this would be a good time to remove our excess pencil lines. So you're going to want to come in and erase out your guidelines there. That's the most important part. We can leave our format on there if we want, or we can erase that out at this point. We're only going to be kind of watercoloring into the format area, so if we leave the lines, it's probably okay. If I was matting this, I would kind of matte over or along those lines so they wouldn't show. All right, and we can also erase out some of our sketching lines from there. And so now we just have the pen. So if you didn't have a waterproof pen, you could do all the inking afterwards. You would probably want to complete that last step with a darker pencil maybe, so you'll be able to see it through the watercolor. And you do want to like pay attention to the details of the contours when you're doing that, so that your watercolor all ends up in the right place, and then you can ink it when you're done. That's fine too. But if you have a waterproof pen, you can ink it and then erase out all the pencil pretty easily. All right, I think we're ready to move on to the watercolors. All right, so now we're going to start with the watercolor. So let's try to find that hand pose again. I feel like I've kind of figured out how to do it. That has to go under. Grabbed it like that so easily the first time. All right, that seems more or less all right. Got that there. Okay. So I've also got my palette cam going. So yeah, let's get started. Let's see. First, I'm gonna like paint in the hand area. I'm gonna use a light wash for this. We just want to lay down kind of our lightest tone. So I'm just coming in and wetting the whole hand here. I don't want to get water other places beside the hand because my pigment is going to kind of travel to anywhere that's wet. And since I'm on the angled board, I have to keep in mind that my water and my paint might drip. If you're working on a flat table, you don't have to worry about that. Might be good at this point, if you don't want to worry about that, to move to a flat table if you've been using like an angled board or something like that up until this point. You've got your drawing done, so you don't have to worry as much about the distortion that having it flat on the table causes. All right, so I've got that. Now I'm going to move over to my palette and mix some color. So what I want to look for is kind of the lightest tone that I can see. So it's kind of that highlight tone. So I want to go in. It seems like it's close to pink. So kind of a red wash. So let's mix some red in here. Wet that cake. Let that start dissolving a little bit. Add some into here. So we want a nice light wash. It's going to lighten a little bit since the paper's wet. But we want to apply it lightly to start. I'm going to add a little bit of orange to this, but it's really kind of closest to a pink. And let's see how that's going on. That's all right. That'll work. So I'm just going to tone the whole hand area with that kind of lightest shade there. You don't need to worry too much about the color being perfect, but we do want to try to get the values right. So let's kind of go in and kind of dab areas if they get too light. I'm not too worried about it, but these fingertip highlights might be a little light or a little dark. Sorry, I meant dark. Just going to kind of get a base tone in there. So we can kind of layer and adjust with our watercolors as long as we don't go too dark in the beginning. So just kind of keep everything light and we should be all right. Mixing in the lid is nice because it allows us to keep the wash the same consistency. So be careful about dipping your brush because that's going to add water to it. If you add more pigment, you need to readjust. So be careful about what you're doing there. All right, so that's a good kind of wash for the hand area. Now we need to let that dry for a little bit. So what I'm going to do in the meantime is kind of get some of that bone color in. So let's see what we're working with. So I think we got some yellows in there. They're really faint though, so we want to mix kind of a thin yellow wash. I'm going to go pretty thin. I'm also going to add a little bit of brown to just kind of mute the saturation a little bit. It seems like it should work. I'm going to add a little more water. A little more yellow too, I think. That might be a little more brown than I wanted. I'm going to go ahead and wet that again. So I'm tinting it just slightly, just kind of with my dirty brush. That might actually be enough. So I'm going to go ahead and wet this, but I may not add much more tone to it. All right, there are some areas that have a little more yellow to them, so I'm going to hit some of those. But I'm not going to do much because some of this gets pretty light, so I don't want to go too dark over the whole thing. All right, so I'm going to let that dry for a couple minutes. Then we'll be back. All right, that shouldn't take long to dry. While we're waiting though, we can wet other colors we're going to use. I'm going to kind of work from lighter to darker. Cleaning off my brush a little bit in between, also getting a little more water on there. You just kind of want to let those saturate and dissolve. And then I'm going to mix kind of a shadow tone. So I want to go in, get these different shadows in my hand area. So let's mix a tone for that. I'm going to go with some blue and some red, I think. So I should end up with something kind of purpley. We'll put that over here, I think. Red. I should probably clean my brush before I add the red, eh? I don't want it to be super saturated. It actually looks pretty good. It's getting pretty muddy there. Maybe a little more blue. And I think I'm going to go with a little brown just to desaturate everything. All right. So that went pretty strong brown. Add some more blue to it. All right, that's a pretty good, fairly desaturated color tone. All right, so let's see how that looks. That'll do. I think that'll be fine. And so now I'm going to go in and lay in those shadows. So let's see. I'm just going to start pulling that in. Nothing to it but to do it. You might want to switch to like your smaller round brush at this point in time. By you, I mean I. Let's see. I may do that in a second here. All right. Yeah, I'm going to kind of move to that smaller round brush. This is my smaller round brush. That should be good for getting kind of finer details. I'm going to try to get it into a point. All right. Got shadow over here as well. If it doesn't get dark enough the first time, that's okay. We can just kind of worry about blocking in and build up the value as we need to. The main thing we want to be careful of is getting too dark. Kind of go down to here. The round brush is good because it's got kind of a fine tip. You can also use the sides to get kind of bigger areas, so it has some versatility to it. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm really only worried about the larger shadow blocks to start. Let's kind of get those. Let's see. What do we think there? That kind of goes like this. Kind of runs along like this. We got some coming up. Yeah, that seems about right. Let's kind of get this into position. Oh, maybe about there. So for this phase, we really want to try to separate the shadow areas from the light areas. That can be kind of hard with the subtle differences. So you kind of want to squint your vision. It's going to reduce the detail, but it makes it a little easier to see the contrast. It's pretty subtle shading over here, so I'm kind of just hitting it with my thirsty brush. This brush is like almost exhausted. I can lay that in first, and then if I need to go darker, I can add more. This area is not as dark as these shadows here, so I'm kind of being careful not to get too much pigment on there. Okay, let's see, any shadow. Maybe just kind of add just a little bit of transition here. We got pretty full light coming on straight, more or less straight on, but the edges going into shadow a little bit. Just do a little to start, and we can add more if we want. All right, pretty happy with that shadow map for now. So I'm going to leave that be. Well, maybe I'll do a little more here along this. Document some of that stuff that's happening right there. And we got a little bit of a blurred edge there, so I'm going to add just a little water, kind of fuzz that. There. All right. Cool, that works for me for now. Let's go in and kind of build up a little more shadow here with the tone we've got, just kind of in those deeper recesses. I'll layer another layer on top of here, just where it gets a little darker in there. Maybe on top of this crease. Oh yeah, it gets kind of deep in here. Let's add a little more there, a little more pigment. All right, I think that should do for now. I'm going to let that dry. So my shadow tones in here look a little more blue to me. So I'm going to go ahead and mix kind of a bluer tone. I think I'll just use that same well since I'm almost empty in there. Just going to add a little blue to that. So similar kind of desaturated tone, just a little bluer. I'm going to add a little more liquid because I'm not confident that's going to be enough. Let's see. Might be a little oversaturated now, but I think we're okay. Let's test a little bits of that. So it's nice to have a little margin like this so you have a spot to test, but you can also keep a scrap of watercolor paper around to test on. Lay in some shadow here. Want to be careful because it can bleed into this other shadow tone. With the shadow tones, the bleeding isn't as much of a problem, but with kind of lighter areas and higher intensity colors, it can be a real issue. So again, I'm just kind of squinting at this and looking for big shadow blocks. Like there's one that runs through here, one that runs through here, we can use those, and one that runs down here. This one's a little subtler, I'm gonna wait on that one. So let's try to paint in that edge first. Got a little on there I don't think I want. Yeah, actually that looks all right. Paint that in. So don't worry if you go too light because you can build this up. The real danger is going too dark on this. Feeling pretty good about that tone. Lay it in. A little bit of a shadow here from that finger. And then we got a shadow under here. So that's kind of interesting right here. So you can see this shadow tone has like a blue color, but this one's a little more purple. That's because of the reddish tinge reflecting off my finger. Kind of interesting. All right, I'm going to add a little more, kind of another layer to this shadow where it's a little darker, and to here. Give me a little more pigment buildup. I'm going to leave this shadow here because that looks pretty good. Add a little bit of red now. Oh, that's a lot of red. I think we're probably all right. that shadow up just a little bit more. All right. And I'm going to add a little bit of that to here as well. All right, so I've got kind of a purpler tone with a little more red in it, and I think we could probably use that in here. So anytime we make a new shadow tone, if I've got paint left over, I'm thinking about, like, where would I be able to use that up a little bit? Is there anywhere that could use like more purple or go a little darker? That's how we are economical with our watercolor. All right, so I'm pretty happy with those shadow tones now. I'm gonna let that dry for a little bit, and then we'll come back in and we'll adjust and add some color to the lighter areas, because this is a little darker and less pink than we see right now. So we're gonna kind of add some orange to it, but we'll let it sit for a minute. All right, so now we're gonna adjust some of the color and value throughout here. So it's feeling more red, but a little more orangey to me. So I'm gonna try to mix a little more orange tone over here. Let's turn on the palette cam. Here it is. Boom. All right. So I'm gonna mix a little bit of orange in here. A lot of red. Let's do like a little bit of addition and pulling. Okay, so what we're gonna do, we're gonna add pigment with our round brush, then we're gonna pull it. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. I'll get a little bit of pigment on here. I'm gonna add that to the tip of the thumb here. And then I can use my other brush here, just with some water. I'm gonna wet it, and then I'm gonna wipe it off a little bit. And then I'm just gonna kind of pull the pigment. So this is a good way to add a little bit of a pigment at a time until you feel good about it. All right, I've got a little more orange in here. Add that, wipe my brush, then pull. This area looks a little more orangey to me. So I can take a dab of orange, kind of straight from the cake. Dab it on there. Wash my brush, wipe it, and then start pulling that. All right, down through here, it looks a little bit redder to me. So I'm gonna use some of my slightly redder tone. It actually seems like kind of lighter and a little bit more towards a pink. So a little bit less saturation. So I'm gonna take some water, just try to pull a little bit more of that pigment off, lighten that back up. So you can move the pigment around as long as things are still wet. All right, so let's kind of look in here. What do we see? It's pretty light in there, maybe a little darker here. So I'm gonna add a little bit of shadow tone. This is already on a wet surface, so I can move it around pretty easily. I can just really very subtly darken it up. Maybe I'm gonna go a little redder in this area. All right, so the key is we're using really light tones in the wet area. So when they bleed, it just kind of blends in nicely. If you go with something that's real dark or high saturation, you're gonna kind of see that bleeding moving around. Let's show you. It's gonna kind of bloom like that. And that's gonna look potentially weird and like you don't have control over it. Just kind of want to blend that in. And if we have any areas where there's like really sharp colors that are, you know, kind of crisp details, we can come back in and get that with a dry brush. All right, so in here, what are we seeing? Looks like we've got a little bit more orangey. Add a little yellow to that. That's getting there. And then we get a lot more orange in the arm section here. That's a lot. That's too much. Some water to the rescue. Actually feel pretty happy about that, but maybe we want to add some yellow to it. All right, so that's kind of the idea, just kind of adding color where it's needed and getting things a little closer to what we see. Also dab a little bit. All right, that's pretty decent. Let's look at the bone a little bit here. Mix a little more of my blue tone. I'm gonna keep this separate, I think. Oh, that's a lot of brown. I don't want that much brown. One more blue in there. There we go. That's good. Got kind of a deep dark color in there, so I'm gonna mix a little brown, a little bit of black. Oh, it's too much black. Pull some of this out over here. Yeah, it should be all right. There we go. All right, anywhere else we need real dark? Just a little sneak in there. I'm gonna try to fuzz some of these edges a little bit. Kind of pull a little extra tone along the creases. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. We'll leave it be for now. Maybe we'll do some adjustment in a minute. But I am seeing that we've got kind of a cool shadow here cast on the paper, and I'm pretty into that. So I'm going to include that in my painting here. I'm going to mix some, has a pretty blue tone to me. I'm going to mix some pretty saturated blue. All right. Kind of just outline the shadow here. I'm not super worried about it being perfectly accurate. It's a little harder to tell if a shadow is exactly correct, so not too worried about it. Oh, it's gonna drip. There. Again, like same idea. I'm doing it pretty light to start, but I can just keep adding pigment to that. You can do whatever you want with the background though. You can just do white background. You can leave it the way it is. You could just do a color. You could splotch stuff on there. You could just play around with the background while you're waiting for other things to dry. Whatever. You know. This just seemed interesting to me, so that's what I'm going with. There's a couple spots in here that are pretty dark, so I'm going to get some pigment straight from the cake. Add those in. You can see those blooms happening in the wet area. That shadow might be a fun place to kind of let those blooms develop however they want. A little more water. Pull the pigment a little bit. Just make the transitions a little more gradual. I'm going to let those kind of develop. That's kind of fun. Pull over here. All right, so like looking at it, the values on my camera are a little bit different from what I'm seeing in life, but I've still got it fairly light in here. I could continue to work this and darken it. But I think I'm gonna kind of wrap it for now. Maybe just a little more kind of here along this edge. I'll maybe wet my brush and pull that pigment a little bit. Yeah, that actually seems pretty good on the other edge. Make this shadow a little deeper though, right here, just that bit. All right, so yeah, that's kind of the idea. Oh, maybe a little tone here. Whoops, that's too much. Move it around, blend it in. So yeah, that's kind of the idea. All right, so I may show you how to cheat a little bit on some of this stuff and do a little more line work perhaps, but we're pretty much done. All right, we're gonna try and add a few finishing touches now. So let's see, let's get my bone, try to get my grip reestablished on it. There we are. That's about right, we're getting there. All right, so at this point, I've kind of allowed everything to dry, and I can add kind of stronger touches of color. So I could go darker with this whole thing if I wanted, but I don't think I want to mess with that. So what I'm going to do, I think I'm going to add a little more kind of red tone. So I'm going to wet that, put a little down here. I'm going to kind of mix it thick, just kind of pull. So I'm going to do a little more red tone on my fingers here because they're looking pretty red to me. Just kind of starting at the fingertips and then pulling that pigment down. So at this point we can add any like intense colors we have. So my object doesn't have a lot of high saturation areas to it, but yours might. If it does, this would be a good time to add those high saturation touches in. So I'm kind of showing you how that would work with this. So you can thicken up that paint, make sure everything's dry underneath so it doesn't bleed. You can add any like higher saturation, more intense colors. You can also add darker colors at that point. I'm not seeing as much on there. Let's do a little here. I'll just do a little along there. We'll kind of define the tip of that finger a little bit. You can kind of build this up slowly so you don't get too much intensity at once. So you can kind of add like that throughout as you need to. Got a little more kind of purple tone on my nail there. Add a little more purple to my, oh, that's my brown. There we go. It's a little later now, so it's getting kind of dark in here. Hopefully it's not affecting the video too much. But yeah, if I wanted to make the shadows a little darker, kind of sneak into some of these pockets. Anywhere you want to add higher intensity or darker color, you can do it like that. I put my watch back on too, but we're just going to ignore that. So we're also going to talk a little bit about cheating. So if you wanted to cheat a little bit, a trick you can use is to use a little bit of white gouache or tempera paint. So this is like a water-based paint, but it is opaque and can provide some coverage. So let's say I went a little overboard on my bone here and I wanted to add some highlights back in. I could do that. Or if I want to kind of add some highlights to the fingertips, I can do that as well. Let's see. It's a challenge every time I have to regrip this thing. Okay, that goes back there. Yeah, there we are. I had a real tight, kind of specific initial grip, and I'm having a hard time getting it back every time. But if I clean my brush off, I'm still getting some red on the mat here, on the paper towel. If I dip a little of this, I can add kind of highlights. So I got kind of a little highlight on my fingertip here and here. So if I wanted to pop those in, I could just a little dab right there. A little dab right here. And then if you want to blend those in a little bit, you can use this. Oh, that wasn't right. Oh, my brush was dirty. There we go. Let's get that back on there. But if you need to make a correction or lighten something up, you can use a little bit of tempera or gouache. And we can kind of blend it in a little bit with this other brush. Make it look a little less jarring. But you can do that and cheat a little bit. That gives you a little bit of forgiveness and correction. Since we've got a little bit of that still, let's go ahead and I'm going to do kind of a thin wash. We had more of a blue tone. Just real thin in here, kind of through here. The texture in there would be super tricky to get accurately with watercolor, so I'm not going to fight my materials too much. I won't worry about it that much. Let's pull a little of that pigment off. There we go. All right, but if I want to come in, kind of add some highlights as well. So probably not noticeable until it's contrasted by that slight yellow. So against that slight yellow we added earlier, should pop just a little bit. Kind of build that up to where we want it to be. Could also do some of this texture in here if we want. Anyway, you don't want to go too nuts with the gouache or the tempera, just to kind of keep it subtle. Think about it as kind of emergency correction fluid, and the preferred solution is just to keep the rest of it clean. You also might add a little bit of that to like the ends of your nails. My nails are dirty. Been doing too much art, not enough nail cleaning. That happens sometimes. It's kind of glaring, so I'm going to blend that in a little bit. Ooh, maybe I have too much pigment on there. Let's give it a dab. There we go. Smooth that out. There we go. Anyway, I'm not going to belabor this too much. Hopefully you get the general idea there. So there we go. That's kind of our intro to hand holding an object in watercolor. And so there we go. I hope that helps, and test it out, see what you can do. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.